May 8, 1945. Winston Churchill stood on a balcony overlooking Whitehall, waving to a crowd of hundreds of thousands celebrating victory in Europe. The war against Hitler was over. Britain had survived. Churchill smiled for the cameras. He flashed his famous V for victory sign. He gave speeches praising the Allied triumph and the unity of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. But Churchill was lying, not about the victory, about the unity. Because just days earlier, Churchill had given his military chiefs an order so explosive that it would remain classified for the next 50 years. He told them to plan an attack on the Soviet Union, not a defensive contingency, not a theoretical exercise. A full-scale military offensive to begin on July 1st, 1945, less than 8 weeks away. The target was the Red Army, the same force that had just helped destroy Nazi Germany. The operation had a code name that Churchill himself may have chosen: Operation Unthinkable. And for half a century, the British government denied it ever existed. Churchill's distrust of Stalin wasn't new. It went back to the beginning of the alliance itself. In November 1943, Churchill traveled to Tehran for his first meeting with both Roosevelt and Stalin together. He expected the conference to cement the Western alliance against Soviet expansion. Instead, he watched in horror as Franklin Roosevelt publicly sided with Stalin against him. Roosevelt mocked Churchill at dinner to make Stalin laugh. He dismissed British concerns about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe. Churchill returned from Tehran deeply shaken. He told his doctor, Lord Morn, that Roosevelt had no idea what he was dealing with. Stalin wasn't an ally. Stalin was a predator, waiting for the right moment to devour everything he could reach. But Roosevelt wouldn't listen. He told Churchill directly that he could handle Stalin. He said Stalin wasn't interested in expansion, just security for the Soviet Union. Churchill knew this was dangerously naive. He had been warning about totalitarian threats since the 1930s, when he stood nearly alone against appeasement of Hitler. Now he saw the same pattern repeating with Stalin. February 1945. The Big Three met again at Yalta, in the Soviet Crimea. Roosevelt was visibly dying. He had weeks to live, though few knew it at the time. Churchill watched as Roosevelt gave Stalin everything he wanted. Poland would have free elections, Stalin promised. But Poland's government would be friendly to the Soviet Union. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. Churchill tried to fight for Poland. Britain had gone to war in 1939 specifically to defend Polish independence. 200,000 Polish troops had fought alongside the British throughout the war. Roosevelt sided with Stalin, again. Churchill later wrote that he left Yalta knowing that Eastern Europe was lost. He had been overruled by an American president who trusted Stalin more than his own British ally. The Yalta agreements gave Stalin effective control over Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The Red Army was already occupying these countries. Stalin had no intention of leaving. Churchill returned to London and immediately began preparing for what he believed was inevitable: a confrontation with the Soviet Union. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died. Harry Truman became president. Churchill saw an opportunity. Truman was inexperienced, but he didn't share Roosevelt's naive trust in Stalin. Perhaps the Americans could be convinced to take a harder line, but Churchill wasn't willing to wait for American policy to change. In early May, he summoned his military chiefs and gave them an extraordinary order. Plan an offensive against the Soviet Union. Objective: push the Red Army back and force Stalin to honor his agreements about Poland and Eastern Europe. Target date: July 1st, 1945. The British Joint Planning Staff was stunned. The war against Germany wasn't even over yet. Berlin hadn't fallen, but Churchill wanted them planning the next war before the current one finished. The planners were professionals. They didn't question whether the order was wise. They simply began calculating what it would take to attack the largest army on Earth. The planning staff faced an immediate problem. The numbers didn't work. By May 1945, the Soviet Union had roughly 7 million men under arms in the Western theater. The Red Army had 170 divisions in Europe compared to the Allies' 47. They had more tanks, more artillery, and more aircraft than the Western Allies combined. Britain and America had approximately 4 million troops in Europe. They were exhausted after years of fighting. Many American units were already being redeployed to the Pacific for the invasion of Japan. The planners calculated that the Soviets outnumbered Western forces in Europe by roughly 2.5 to 1. In tanks and aircraft, the disparity was even worse. Churchill's military chiefs told him the obvious truth. A conventional attack on the Soviet Union would fail. The Red Army would absorb the initial blow and then counterattack with overwhelming force. Churchill had anticipated this problem. He had a solution that shocked even his own generals. Churchill proposed using German soldiers, not just a few advisors or specialists. Churchill wanted to rearm 100,000 Wehrmacht troops who had just surrendered to the Western Allies. German soldiers who had been fighting Britain for 6 years would be given their weapons back and sent to fight the Soviets. The planning staff was appalled. These were the same Germans who had bombed London, killed British soldiers across North Africa and Europe, and committed atrocities throughout the war. British families were still burying their dead, and Churchill wanted to arm the enemy and march alongside them. Churchill was unmoved. He argued that German soldiers knew how to fight the Russians. They had been doing it for 4 years. They understood Soviet tactics, Soviet weaknesses, Soviet vulnerabilities. More importantly, they were available. There were over 2 million German prisoners of war in Western Allied hands. Even 100,000 would significantly improve the force ratio for an attack. The planning staff noted Churchill's proposal, but made clear their doubts about German reliability and morale. They also noted the political impossibility of explaining to the British public why their sons would be fighting alongside yesterday's enemies. Churchill's plan had another fatal flaw. It required American participation. Britain alone couldn't defeat the Soviet Union. But Churchill hadn't consulted President Truman or General Eisenhower. He couldn't. If the Americans refused, the plan was dead. If word leaked to Stalin, the consequences would be catastrophic. Churchill was essentially planning to drag America into a Third World War without asking permission. The planners assessed American participation as doubtful. There was also the Pacific War. America was still fighting Japan. Truman's focus was ending that war, not starting a new one in Europe. By late May 1945, the Joint Planning Staff completed their assessment of Operation Unthinkable. Their conclusion was devastating. The operation was hazardous. In military planning language, this was as close as professional officers came to saying suicidal. The planners laid out the problems. Soviet numerical superiority was overwhelming. Soviet morale was high after their victories. Soviet industry was producing weapons at a rate the West couldn't match. An initial Western offensive might gain some ground, but the Soviets would retreat, absorb the blow, and counterattack with their massive reserves. Within weeks, the Red Army would be advancing westward. The planners estimated that if the attack failed, Soviet forces could reach the English Channel. Britain itself could be invaded. The assessment was clear. Operation Unthinkable would likely fail, and failure meant Soviet domination of all Europe, not just the East. Churchill read the assessment. He didn't argue with it. Instead, he ordered a second version focused on defending Western Europe against a Soviet attack. Then he filed both versions with the highest classification and waited to see what Stalin would do. In July 1945, the British people voted. Churchill, the war hero, the man who had saved Britain from Hitler, lost in a landslide. Clement Attlee and the Labour Party won 393 seats to the Conservatives' 197. The man who had ordered Operation Unthinkable was no longer in power. Churchill handed power to Attlee on July 26, 1945. Operation Unthinkable went with him into the classified files, unknown to the new government, unknown to the public. Attlee had no interest in military confrontation with the Soviets. The plans sat in sealed folders, waiting. Operation Unthinkable remained classified for over 5 decades. The British government denied its existence whenever questions arose. Historians suspected something. Churchill's rhetoric in 1945 and 1946 was increasingly hostile to the Soviet Union. His famous Iron Curtain speech in March 1946 warned that Soviet domination of Eastern Europe was permanent and dangerous. But the idea that Churchill had actually planned to attack Stalin seemed too extreme. Most historians dismissed it as speculation. Then in 1998, the British Public Record Office declassified the documents. Operation Unthinkable was real. Churchill had ordered an attack on the Soviet Union for July 1, 1945. He had proposed rearming 100,000 German soldiers. He had been willing to risk World War III to prevent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Every detail that seemed too extreme to believe was confirmed in the official files. The question that Operation Unthinkable raises is uncomfortable. Was Churchill right? The plan was militarily reckless. The Joint Planning Staff correctly assessed that it would probably fail. An attack on the Soviet Union in July 1945 would likely have resulted in Soviet armies reaching the Atlantic. But Churchill's underlying analysis was correct. Stalin had no intention of honoring his agreements. Eastern Europe was going to fall under communist dictatorship. The Western democracies were going to do nothing to stop it. Churchill saw this clearly while Roosevelt was still promising that Stalin could be trusted. Churchill understood that the wartime alliance would collapse the moment the war ended. The Iron Curtain descended exactly as Churchill predicted. Millions of people in Eastern Europe spent the next 4 decades under Soviet domination. The Cold War lasted until 1991. Operation Unthinkable was impossible. But Churchill was right about why it felt necessary. Operation Unthinkable reveals something important about Churchill and about leadership in crisis. Churchill was willing to consider options that others dismissed as impossible. He asked his military chiefs to plan for something that seemed insane because he believed the alternative was worse. He was wrong about the military feasibility, but he was right about the strategic problem. The Soviet Union was an enemy pretending to be an ally. The post-war world would be shaped by that reality. Churchill's greatest strength was his willingness to see threats that others denied. He had done it with Hitler in the 1930s when almost everyone else wanted to believe that peace was possible. He did it again with Stalin in 1945. The difference was that in 1939, Britain had options. In 1945, it didn't. The military balance made confrontation impossible. Churchill had to accept an outcome he hated because the alternative was even worse. Operation Unthinkable failed. The Cold War happened instead. But for a few weeks in the spring of 1945, Winston Churchill tried to prevent it with a plan so audacious that his own government hid it for 50 years. That's the story they kept classified until 1998. The operation they called Unthinkable, and the Prime Minister who was willing to think it anyway. August 17, 1943. 2 columns of dust rose on the winding roads leading to Messina, Sicily. One flew the Union Jack, the other flew the Stars and Stripes. Both commanders had driven their men to exhaustion for weeks, not to defeat the Germans, but to beat each other to the prize. George S. Patton sat in his command vehicle, pushing his driver to go faster. Somewhere on a parallel road, Bernard Montgomery was doing the same thing. The port city of Messina was the symbolic trophy of the entire Sicilian campaign. Whoever entered first would claim victory. Whoever arrived second would spend the rest of the war remembering this humiliation. And both men knew it. Patton's 3rd Infantry Division reached the outskirts of Messina on the evening of August 16th. His men pushed through the night, fighting exhaustion, and scattered German rearguards. By dawn on August 17th, American soldiers were entering the city. Montgomery's troops arrived hours later. The British general found American flags already flying over Messina. Patton had won the race, and Montgomery would never forgive him for it. To understand why these two men despised each other, you have to understand who Montgomery was in the summer of 1943. He wasn't just a British general. He was the British general, the hero of El Alamein, the man who had finally defeated Rommel. Britain had suffered nothing but defeats for 3 years. Dunkirk, Greece, Crete, Singapore, Tobruk. The British Army had been humiliated across 3 continents. Then Montgomery arrived in North Africa, and everything changed. El Alamein in October 1942 was Britain's first major land victory of the war. Churchill called it the end of the beginning. Montgomery became the most famous British soldier since Wellington. He was arrogant, theatrical, and absolutely certain he was the finest general alive. He wore a distinctive black beret with 2 cap badges. He issued personal messages to his troops. He cultivated relationships with journalists who portrayed him as a military genius. George Patton had a problem. He was arguably the best tactical commander in the Allied forces, but almost nobody knew it yet. The Americans had embarrassed themselves at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. German panzers had routed inexperienced American troops, killing or capturing thousands. Patton was brought in to fix the disaster. He took command of 2nd Corps and transformed it in weeks through brutal discipline and aggressive training. Soldiers who had been slovenly and undisciplined suddenly looked like professionals. Units that had broken under fire learned to hold their ground. By the time the North African campaign ended, American forces had proven themselves in combat. But Montgomery got the credit. Montgomery was the theater star. Patton was a supporting actor who had cleaned up someone else's mess. The British press barely mentioned American contributions. Montgomery gave interviews suggesting his 8th Army had carried the campaign while the Americans learned how to fight. And Patton seethed. The plan for Sicily was where the hatred truly began. Operation Husky would be the first major Allied invasion of Europe, the dress rehearsal for everything that came after. And Montgomery demanded control. The original plan gave both armies meaningful objectives. Patton's 7th Army would land on the western beaches and drive toward Palermo. Montgomery's 8th Army would land on the eastern beaches and drive toward Messina. 2 thrusts, 2 armies, shared glory. Montgomery rejected this plan. He insisted that his 8th Army should have the primary role. He wanted the Americans relegated to protecting his flank while British forces captured the important objectives. He went over the heads of American commanders and appealed directly to Eisenhower. Eisenhower, desperate to maintain Allied unity, gave Montgomery what he wanted. The plan was rewritten. Patton's army would guard Montgomery's flank while Montgomery made the main assault toward Messina. Patton was furious. He had been reduced to a supporting role in what should have been an equal partnership. He told his staff that Montgomery had stolen the campaign before it even started. But he followed orders, for now. Montgomery's plan fell apart almost immediately. His 8th Army landed successfully on the eastern beaches, but then ran into fierce German resistance around Catania. The Germans had fortified the coastal road that Montgomery needed to reach Messina. Day after day, Montgomery's forces attacked. Day after day, they were thrown back. The Eighth Army, which was supposed to sprint to Messina while the Americans watched, was stuck in bloody stalemate. Montgomery blamed everyone but himself. He blamed the terrain. He blamed the Germans for fighting too hard. He blamed the Americans for not drawing enough German forces away from his front. What he never did was admit that his plan had failed. Meanwhile, Patton was guarding Montgomery's flank with a much larger force than the mission required. He had an entire army sitting idle, while Montgomery bled his troops against German defenses. Patton saw an opportunity. Patton went to his commander, General Harold Alexander, with a proposal. Instead of sitting on Montgomery's flank, he would drive west across Sicily and capture Palermo. It wasn't part of the plan. But the plan was already failing. Alexander, a British general who understood that something had to change, gave Patton permission. Patton unleashed his army in one of the most spectacular advances of the war. In just 72 hours, Patton's forces covered over 100 miles of mountainous terrain. They captured Palermo on July 22nd, taking thousands of prisoners and massive quantities of supplies. It was exactly the kind of bold, aggressive movement that Montgomery had failed to execute on the other side of the island. The press went wild. Suddenly, George Patton was front-page news around the world. The American general who had captured a major city while the famous Montgomery was stuck in the mud. Patton had stolen the spotlight, and he had done it deliberately. Montgomery was humiliated. He sent messages to Alexander complaining that Patton was grandstanding. He argued that capturing Palermo was meaningless because Messina was the real objective. But everyone knew the truth. Patton had shown him up. With Palermo captured, Patton turned east toward Messina. Now both armies were racing for the same prize. The competition that the Allied High Command had tried to prevent was happening anyway. Montgomery pushed his exhausted troops harder. He tried flanking movements around the German defenses. He launched amphibious operations to land troops behind enemy lines. Nothing worked fast enough. Patton drove his men relentlessly. He accepted casualties that a more cautious commander would have avoided. He used his own amphibious operations, leapfrogging troops along the northern coast. He was determined to reach Messina first, no matter what it cost. The rivalry had become personal in a way that affected operational decisions. Both commanders were taking risks and pushing their men beyond reasonable limits, not because military necessity demanded it, but because neither could stand losing to the other. Patton won. His 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina on August 17, 1943, hours before Montgomery's forces arrived. When a British patrol finally reached the city, they found American soldiers already in control. Patton staged a theatrical welcome. He greeted the arriving British officers with exaggerated courtesy, rubbing their faces in his victory while pretending to be gracious. Montgomery was not present. He had sent subordinates rather than witness his humiliation personally. The message was clear to everyone watching. The American Army was not the junior partner Montgomery had dismissed. George Patton was not a supporting actor in Montgomery's war. The special relationship between Britain and America would be a rivalry as much as an alliance. Patton wrote to his wife that it was the greatest moment of his career. He had beaten the famous Montgomery in a fair race, but the victory came with a cost that Patton didn't yet understand. During the Sicilian campaign, George Patton made 2 catastrophic mistakes that nearly ended his career. He slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue in field hospitals, accusing them of cowardice. The incidents became public. Eisenhower was furious. The press demanded Patton's dismissal. Politicians called for his court-martial. Patton was forced to apologize publicly to the soldiers he had struck, to the medical staff who had witnessed it, and to every division in his army. Eisenhower kept Patton in uniform because he believed Patton was too valuable to lose. But the slapping incidents gave Eisenhower a reason to sideline Patton when it came time to plan the invasion of France. Montgomery had his own complaints about Patton's behavior in Sicily. He told anyone who would listen that Patton was undisciplined, reckless, and unsuited for high command. The slapping incidents proved Montgomery right in the eyes of many senior officers. When D-Day planning began, Montgomery was named ground commander for the invasion. Patton was left in England, commanding a fictional army designed to deceive the Germans. The man who had won Sicily was being used as a decoy while Montgomery led the real invasion. June 6, 1944. The Allies invaded France, and Bernard Montgomery was in command of all ground forces. American, British, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches under Montgomery's overall direction. It was the pinnacle of his career. Patton watched from England, commanding phantom divisions in a deception operation. He was the most aggressive commander in the Allied armies, and he was sitting out the most important battle of the war. Montgomery's performance in Normandy was controversial from the start. He promised to capture the city of Caen on D-Day. It took over a month. He launched offensive after offensive that gained little ground at enormous cost. The British sector became a grinding stalemate. Montgomery blamed the terrain, the weather, the Germans, and privately the Americans for not attacking aggressively enough. What he never admitted was that his own cautious, methodical style was poorly suited for the breakout that Normandy required. On August 1st, 1944, George Patton finally got his chance. His Third Army became operational in France, and he was given the mission of exploiting the breakout that American forces had finally achieved at Saint-Lô. What followed was one of the most spectacular campaigns in military history. Patton's armored columns swept across France at speeds that seemed impossible. They covered 30, 40, 50 miles a day. They liberated towns so fast that German garrisons surrendered to forward units, while rear headquarters still thought the front was miles away. In 2 weeks, Patton's Third Army advanced further than Montgomery's forces had moved in 2 months. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While Montgomery was still fighting for every hedgerow in his sector, Patton was racing toward Germany. Montgomery watched his rival's success with barely concealed fury. He complained that Patton was getting preferential treatment in supplies and reinforcements. He argued that Patton's recklessness would lead to disaster. But the newspapers didn't care about Montgomery's methodical approach. They cared about Patton's tanks racing across France. The American general was becoming the most famous Allied commander of the war. As Allied forces approached Germany, Montgomery demanded a change in strategy. He wanted all available resources concentrated for a single thrust into Germany under his command. He would drive straight to Berlin and end the war by Christmas. Patton wanted the opposite. He believed his Third Army could break through German defenses and reach the Rhine before Montgomery even got started. He argued for a broad front strategy with multiple axes of advance. Eisenhower sided with neither man completely. He approved a broad front approach that kept both armies moving, but he gave Montgomery priority for a special operation. Market Garden would drop paratroopers behind German lines to capture bridges in the Netherlands. Patton was furious. Supplies that could have gone to his Third Army were being diverted to Montgomery's airborne gamble. He believed Eisenhower was rewarding failure and punishing success. September 17th, 1944. Operation Market Garden began with the largest airborne assault in history. Thousands of paratroopers dropped into the Netherlands to capture bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. Montgomery's ground forces would race up a single highway to link up with them. It was a disaster. The plan was too ambitious, too dependent on everything going right. German resistance was far stronger than intelligence had predicted. The highway turned into a shooting gallery. At Arnhem, the bridge too far British paratroopers held out for 9 days against overwhelming German forces. Relief never came. Of the 10,000 men dropped at Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. Montgomery declared Market Garden 90% successful. Almost no one agreed. The operation had failed to achieve its strategic objective, consumed enormous resources, and cost thousands of casualties. Patton, who had been forced to halt his advance because supplies went to Market Garden, was vindicated. He had warned that Montgomery's plan was reckless. Now Montgomery's great gamble had failed while Patton's army sat idle for lack of fuel. December 16, 1944. The Germans launched their last major offensive of the war through the Ardennes forest. American forces were caught completely by surprise. Within days, German panzers had created a massive bulge in the Allied lines. Montgomery's forces were north of the bulge. Patton's Third Army was south. Eisenhower gave Montgomery temporary command of American forces north of the breakthrough, while Patton was ordered to wheel his entire army 90 degrees and counterattack from the south. What Patton did next became legendary. He turned 3 divisions from their eastern advance and sent them north in the middle of winter, through terrible weather, over roads clogged with retreating troops. In 48 hours, his forces had moved over 100 miles and were attacking the German flank. It was the most impressive logistical feat of the war. No other commander could have done it. Patton had relieved Bastogne and was rolling up the German advance, while Montgomery was still organizing his counterattack in the north. January 7, 1945. Bernard Montgomery held a press conference about the Battle of the Bulge. What he said nearly destroyed the Allied alliance. Montgomery described how he had taken command of the northern sector when the Americans were reeling from the German attack. He implied that his leadership had saved the situation. He talked about bringing order to chaos and preventing a disaster. He barely mentioned Patton. He barely mentioned the American divisions that had held Bastogne. He made it sound like Montgomery and the British Army had rescued the Americans from their own incompetence. The American press erupted. Patton was livid. Omar Bradley, normally a calm and diplomatic man, threatened to resign if Montgomery was given command of any more American troops. Eisenhower had to personally intervene to prevent the alliance from fracturing. Montgomery had stolen credit for the greatest American victory of the war, Patton's impossible march to Bastogne, the heroic stand of the 101st Airborne, the sacrifices of American soldiers across the Ardennes. All of it was minimized so Montgomery could claim the spotlight. The final months of the war brought one last humiliation for Montgomery. Eisenhower had planned for Montgomery's 21st Army Group to make the main crossing of the Rhine. Montgomery spent weeks preparing an elaborate assault. On March 7, 1945, soldiers from the American 9th Armored Division found the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen still standing. They crossed immediately, establishing the first Allied bridgehead across the Rhine. Patton himself crossed the Rhine on March 22nd with a hasty assault that caught the Germans off guard. He called Bradley that night and added a request. He wanted Bradley to keep it secret until the next day so Patton could get more troops across before Montgomery's carefully planned operation began. When Montgomery launched his massive Rhine crossing on March 23rd, with airborne drops, naval support, and overwhelming artillery, Patton had already been across for a day. The newspapers couldn't help making the comparison. Montgomery needed an army group and weeks of preparation to do what Patton had done on the fly. The Patton-Montgomery rivalry wasn't just personal drama. It had real consequences for the war. Resources that should have gone to whoever could use them best were instead divided to satisfy both egos. Operations were launched not because they were strategically optimal, but because one commander couldn't stand seeing the other get the glory. Eisenhower spent enormous amounts of time and energy managing the rivalry instead of fighting the Germans. He made compromises that satisfied neither man and may have prolonged the war. Soldiers died because their commanders were more focused on beating each other than on beating the enemy. The race to Messina, the competition in Normandy, the arguments about Market Garden, all of it distracted from the mission. George Patton died on December 21, 1945, from injuries sustained in a car accident in Germany. He was 60 years old. He never got to write his memoirs, never got to defend his record against Montgomery's version of events. Bernard Montgomery lived until 1976. He wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and spent decades burnishing his reputation. He outlived almost everyone who could contradict him. In his memoirs, Montgomery wrote that Patton was good for pursuit, but not much else. Patton's diaries called Montgomery a tired little man who would have been fired in any army except the British. But memory has a way of finding the truth. Today, Patton is remembered as one of the greatest American generals in history. Montgomery is remembered as a capable but difficult commander whose reputation exceeded his achievements. Montgomery had more resources, more support, and more political influence throughout the war. He was given command of D-Day, while Patton led a fictional army. He was given priority for Market Garden, while Patton's army ran out of fuel. And with all those advantages, Montgomery's record was mixed at best. Caen took a month instead of a day. Market Garden was a costly failure. His press conference about the bulge revealed a man more concerned with his reputation than with truth. Patton achieved more with less. He won when given the chance. He was right about strategy more often than Montgomery. And he did it all while fighting not just the Germans, but a British rival who wanted him sidelined. That's the verdict of history on the greatest rivalry of World War II. The general who died young is remembered as a legend. The general who lived long enough to write his own story is remembered as something less.